Eliza Bennett was 69 years old, a widow living in the quiet coastal town of Port Haven, Maine. The town itself felt like a painting. Fishing boats anchored near the docks, fog still lingering over the ocean every morning, and tiny antique street lamps lining the narrow roads. Eliza's home was a small white wooden house near the harbour, with pale blue shutters that her late husband, George, had painted himself decades ago. The home carried memories in every corner. The wind chimes George hung by the porch, the old knitted sofa covers Eliza made during winter nights, and the tall bookshelf near the window where decades of community newsletters, volunteer certificates, and storybooks rested neatly. For most of her life, Eliza had served her town as a community library event organizer. She wasn't just the person who arranged reading circles, children's art events, and senior poetry meetups. She was the woman who remembered every child's favorite book, every newcomer's name, and every elder's unspoken loneliness. People still greeted her with warm smiles at the farmer's market, calling her Miss Eliza even long after her retirement. Her daily ritual never changed. Wake at 5 a.m., brew dark coffee, sit by the window, watch seagulls skim the ocean, and whisper a quiet, "Good morning, George," to the empty chair across from her. Widowhood hadn't hardened her, it had softened her in a quiet, heavy way. Some days grief felt light like mist, other days it sat on her chest like a stone. Still, she moved through life steadily, believing love was an action, not a declaration. She never cared about wealth, yet she valued warmth, legacy, and unity more than anything. Everything she ever did, even after George passed away, was rooted in one truth. Family survives when kindness leads. She didn't know then that kindness, when given endlessly without boundaries, could one day resemble erasure more than love. Eliza had 2 children, Caleb Bennett, her firstborn son who was now 38, and Mara Bennett, her daughter who was 34. Growing up, Caleb had always been the spirited one, sharp-minded, confident, and charming, the type of boy who made teachers believe he would one day build something big. Mara, on the other hand, was introspective, observant, and emotionally intelligent, always hugging Eliza a second longer than necessary, sensing emotions before words were spoken. After high school, Caleb pursued business studies, but juggled part-time work and student loans, and Eliza stepped in more times than she could count. She co-signed loans, helped with payments, and quietly insisted that he chase ambition without the fear of falling. Mara pursued social work, inspired by her mother's dedication to community, and though her job paid less, she never asked her mother for $1. As adults, the siblings lived very different lives. Caleb stayed close to Port Haven, believing proximity to his hometown would translate to emotional security. He bought a home that was beautiful on the outside, but financially heavy on the inside. Mortgage, insurance, renovations, upgrades all stacked like waves without pause. Mara lived 3 hours away in a smaller apartment, budgeting tightly, carrying her own weight without complaint, making monthly trips to visit her mother just to fold laundry, restock her pantry, and refill birdseed in the garden feeder. Eliza loved them equally, but differently. With Caleb, her love took the form of rescue. With Mara, it became companionship. She had always believed siblings balanced each other, unaware that adulthood sometimes twists balance into burden and care into expectation. She assumed love given freely would return freely. What she didn't know was that some hearts receive love like currency, never realizing it was meant to be home, not transaction. By the time Caleb hit his mid-30s, his lifestyle outgrew his paycheck. He wanted comfort fast, upgrades instantly, solutions immediately. And each time life pressed too hard, Eliza opened her hands. When his college debt collectors began calling more often, it was Eliza who quietly stepped in with a year's worth of payments, telling him to focus on finding stability. When his old car finally gave up outside a grocery store during a snowstorm, She withdrew savings meant for her own emergency and helped him replace it, brushing off gratitude as unnecessary. When his home insurance skyrocketed after a storm damaged the roof, she handed over the remainder without a sigh. She never called it sacrifice. She called it motherhood. Her late husband, George, once said she gave like rain. Effortless, constant, unaware of how much of herself evaporated in the process. But Caleb never saw evaporation. He saw consistency, and consistency, when not acknowledged, quietly upgrades itself into entitlement. Eliza never complained, because watching her children struggle hurt more than struggling silently for them. She measured joy not by what she had, but by what she could remove from her children's worry list. She missed the small warning signs, the way Caleb stopped saying, "I'll handle it," and began saying, "Can you handle it?" The shift was subtle, like sand sliding under waves, unnoticed until the shore is reshaped. She thought she was building a bridge. She didn't see that it was slowly becoming a stage where her role was written without her permission. Giver, never receiver. Supporter, never supported. Soft place, never soft life. Then came Lydia Moore. Smart, stylish, sharp-tongued, and unapologetically proud of the life she intended to live, Lydia entered Caleb's world like bold ink on white paper, impossible to ignore. From the very beginning, Lydia carried an air of quiet superiority, not loud enough to confront, but sharp enough to wound if examined closely. At first, Eliza thought it was generational difference, maybe modern confidence she didn't understand. Lydia spoke fast, expected faster, and dismissed anything old-fashioned as outdated. Eliza knitted scarves for their first Christmas together. Lydia said, "Cute, but I only wear designer." Eliza brought homemade blueberry bread during their housewarming. Lydia said, "Oh, carbs." Eliza laughed off comments that sliced thinner each time, stacking tiny wounds that didn't bleed openly but bruised slowly. Caleb never defended, but he never directly borrowed his wife's tone either. He simply watched both sides and called it neutrality. Eliza mistook silence for peace. Lydia insisted on control, how dinners were set, how holidays were spent, and eventually how respect was distributed. There was no explosion yet, just a slow rearranging of hierarchy. Lydia at the top, Caleb beside her, and Eliza quietly sliding into a necessary but diminishing figure, like old furniture still used, but never admired. Eliza convinced herself adjustment was love, flexibility was kindness, and endurance was motherhood. She didn't realize she was being trained not to occupy space, but to explain her existence in softer sentences. The tension didn't snap all at once. It stretched, silently, repeatedly, like an elastic band pulled too far, but not yet released. Lydia's expectations became commands wearing polite masks. "Mum, could you refill this?" turned into an extended cup held without eye contact. "Thanks so much for helping," turned into, "Where would we be without you handling these things?" Appreciation was slowly replaced with assumed availability. Eliza began arriving at dinners already asking, "What do you need?" instead of, "How are you?" The shift wasn't noticed until it was complete. Lydia never raised her voice. She simply lowered Eliza's role. It became invisible choreography. Eliza carried plates, Lydia received them. Eliza tidied up, Lydia evaluated. The home wasn't hostile, but it was hierarchical, and kindness was becoming labor without acknowledgement. Caleb, balancing between affection and convenience, mistook his mother's silence for comfort. He believed if she never pushed back, nothing was wrong. But silence wasn't peace. It was preparation for a breaking point no one saw forming. Because endurance has limits, even when love doesn't. And the longest stretching silences often break louder than shouting ever could. The breaking moment came on a chilly Sunday that carried the kind of silence before storms. Caleb and Lydia invited Eliza for a late brunch. The table was immaculate. Linen mats, porcelain plates, cut fruit bowls, handcrafted jam jars, coffee steaming gently, and a vase of white tulips Lydia claimed were imported. Everything looked curated, aesthetic, and unsettlingly staged. Eliza arrived carrying a loaf of homemade pecan bread wrapped in soft cotton cloth. The moment she stepped in, she could feel the pressure in the air, thick but unspoken, like humidity before rain. Caleb smiled first. Lydia did not. Brunch began politely, dangerously polite. Utensils scraped lightly, conversations hovered, but no one truly spoke. Then Lydia leaned back, tapped her acrylic nail once against her empty ceramic cup, and pushed it slightly toward Eliza, without eye contact, without request, without courtesy. Just expectation. It wasn't the first time, but it was the first time it felt intentional, calculated, and visible in its quiet dominance. Eliza hesitated for a fraction of a second. Caleb noticed. Lydia noticed. Time noticed. Lydia exhaled sharply. Not loud, but loaded. She tilted her head just slightly and said, "I mean, if you're done eating, you could help refill the drinks." The words were thin, coated in honey, but sharpened underneath. They weren't a request. They were a verdict. Eliza placed her fork down gently, slower than necessary, hoping the motion would diffuse tension. But Lydia leaned in just enough to ensure impact and added, "I thought family helps family, especially mothers." The word mothers stretched just a second longer than needed, like the twist of a blade that doesn't kill, but makes sure you remember it exists. Caleb cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably, and for the first time, instead of dissolving the tension, he fed it. He looked at Eliza, not with malice, but something softer and somehow crueler. Convenience. "Mum, it's fine. Lydia's right. Can you just help with the drinks?" Eliza blinked, breath tightening invisibly behind her ribs. She wasn't being asked to pour coffee. She was being asked to accept a place assigned to her, not mother, not guest, not elder. Something lesser. Something shrinking. Her pulse thudded gently in her ears. The tulips sat silently, pretty and indifferent. The clock ticked, and the moment was no longer about coffee. Then came the sentence that did not raise its voice, yet cracked open a lifetime of silent endurance. Lydia folded one arm lightly, still polished, still calm, and added, "I don't see the issue. It's family. Either she helps, or—" She paused, glancing at Caleb like the rest of the sentence was his to finish. And he did. Because the most heartbreaking betrayals often come without shouting. Caleb looked at his mother, the woman who once packed his school lunches with handwritten notes, the same woman who lost sleep during his fevers, the same woman who emptied her savings so his life stayed afloat. And he said, with a sigh more than a statement, "Mum, serve Lydia, or you don't stay here." The words landed softly, which made them land heavier. There was no tremor, no slamming, no cinematic explosion, just calm cruelty, the kind that doesn't look like a crime but leaves a wound. Eliza didn't gasp. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her hands or her voice. She didn't fracture into dramatic pieces. Instead, something in her face stilled, like water right before it turns to ice. She reached for her bag, slow, deliberate, almost respectful toward herself. Caleb frowned, expecting resistance. Lydia looked almost amused, expecting surrender. Neither got what they prepared for. Eliza stood, chair whispering behind her against the floorboards. She didn't shake. She didn't tremble. She simply became still enough for both of them to realize this silence was not defeat. It was distance forming itself into a boundary. The room did not echo. It absorbed everything. Because moments like this do not announce themselves loudly. They simply change people forever, without asking permission. Eliza stepped out into the coastal air without performing heartbreak. The sky was pale, undecided, caught between light and storm. The wind carried salt, memory, and something sharper now, clarity. She walked toward her car slowly, coat folded over one arm, posture upright in a way grief couldn't bend. Behind her, no footsteps followed. No voice chased her name. No apology attempted rescue. And in that quiet, empty distance, reality rearranged itself. The greatest pain wasn't the words. It was the absence of hesitation before them. She drove home without music, without tears, without fury. Just a thudding realization that generosity had slowly rewritten her value in the eyes of those she loved most. When she reached the house, she didn't turn on the big lights, only the small lamp near George's old reading chair. Soft amber, loyal, unchanging. Her coat slid gently off her shoulders. She sat down, fingers finding the one object she always touched when the world felt unsteady. George's brass compass, dented on one side from his fishing days, a quiet reminder that directions were meant to guide, not misplace. Her thumbs skimmed the cold metal, tracing circles she didn't fully realize she was drawing, a tight knot pressed just beneath her throat. This time, the tears came, not loud, not shaking, not theatrical. They came the way salt dissolves, silently, thoroughly, irreversible, once mixed in. She had known heartbreak before, losing George had proven that, but this heartbreak was decisive. Not mourning what was gone, but mourning what she incorrectly believed was safe. The next morning didn't carry the softness grief expected. Instead, it carried focus. Eliza brewed coffee like routine, but the cup felt different in her hand, less like comfort, more like punctuation. That night had rearranged something permanent inside her. She didn't want revenge. Revenge shouts, reaches, demands chaos. What she wanted now wore a quieter costume, consequence. Not to punish, but to reclaim what had been slowly borrowed, assumed, and consumed without acknowledgement. She opened the wooden drawer beneath George's old clock, where important papers slept in neat files, insurance documents, savings records, pension notes, property details, and investment accounts she once arranged with the belief the future would be shared. Now the future needed new ownership, not emotional ownership, legal ownership, clear ownership. She didn't pace dramatically. She didn't rehearse speeches. She simply began organizing with the quiet clarity of someone who has stopped negotiating her own worth. Boundaries, she realized, were not walls built out of anger. They were doors built out of survival. By noon, she placed a call not out of emotion, but precision. The attorney on the other line spoke with calm professionalism, unaware that behind Eliza's steady voice was a decades-long architecture of love being rewritten into self-protection. She didn't rant, didn't narrate betrayal. She only spoke instructions, direct, measured, unembellished. She transferred every dollar she had quietly set aside for Caleb. The emergency funds, the hidden mortgage assistance backups, the support she never announced but always extended, into a protected legacy trust designated not for adults who demanded loyalty, but for grandchildren who hadn't yet learned the language of entitlement. The trust was structured airtight. No withdrawals without clauses. No emotional leverage, no guilt access, no manipulation entry point. Meanwhile, the monthly, automatic transfers she had silently maintained for Caleb's household, insurance contributions, loan offsets, supplemental mortgage padding, were cancelled in one composed sequence of confirmations. No announcements, no threatening calls, no dramatic finale, just administration. When the final document was signed digitally, she exhaled once. Small, quiet, but definitive. This wasn't punishment. This was punctuation. A sentence finally ending where it should have years ago. Not spoken out loud, but legally recognized. I was the foundation, not the fallback. Nicholas's downfall wasn't loud. It was slow, quiet, and painfully ordinary. The kind of collapse that doesn't make headlines but breaks lives. First, it was smaller numbers, a late vendor payment, then a delayed rent transfer, Then the sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach, when loans felt less like temporary help and more like permanent chains. The bistro he once bragged about now weighed on him like an unpaid apology. Every time he flipped the open sign to welcome customers in, he felt like a door closing inside himself. The worst part wasn't even the money. It was realizing whose money he had mistaken for his own effort. Marlene had funded the dream, one sacrifice at a time. She had quietly written checks, while Nicholas believed he was writing his own destiny. Now, without her financial presence holding the walls, the cracks were loud. Madison tried to shield her ego by blaming Marlene, calling her manipulative, dramatic, impossible. But Nicholas was too tired to echo her. He had reached a point where self-deception required more energy than honesty, and he was bankrupt in both. Meanwhile, Marlene was rebuilding her life at a pace few noticed, but many admired. She returned to routines that didn't require shrinking. She had tea on her porch, watered roses that never demanded explanations, volunteered at a local senior art group where kindness was currency, and slowly stitched pieces of herself back together without announcing it. Her neighbors began noticing a difference, not sadness healed, but pride reclaimed. Nicholas heard about her through Emily. Every update felt like salt not on a wound, but on a lesson. One evening after closing the bistro, Nicholas sat alone among stacked chairs, listening to the silence of his own making. The lights dimmed automatically, as if the universe was conserving energy on someone who hadn't learned to value it. Bills stacked higher than his ego could hold. The truth was no longer knocking. It had moved in. Emily had become the conscience Nicholas didn't know he needed. She spoke truths without theatrics, sharper than any argument, heavier than any insult. One afternoon, sitting in Marlene's sunroom while folding laundry, Emily said, "Mum wasn't asking for respect. She was waiting for recognition. There's a difference." The words held so much weight that Nicholas repeated them in silence for days after hearing them. Emily had stepped into a role not just as a daughter, but as a witness. She organized Marlene's weeks to bring life back into color. Sunday church gatherings where no one asked personal questions, Wednesday evening literature circles where books healed more than people talked, and Friday community dinners where Marlene was received, not tolerated. She transformed from Nicholas's mum to simply Marlene, an entire identity, not an extension of someone else's story. Nicholas watched her transformation from a distance through social media updates Emily never filtered. One picture struck him hardest. Marlene laughing mid-sentence, eyes crinkled, shoulders unburdened, the laugh reaching her ribs instead of stopping at her lips. It was rare, real, earned. Nicholas realized something terrifying. Her joy was no longer dependent on his presence. That wasn't revenge. That was freedom. And freedom didn't argue. It simply existed, unapologetically. That night, Nicholas stood near Marlene's neighborhood without entering her street. He stayed in the proximity of his childhood, but outside the radius of entitlement. No message, no call. Just gravity pulling regret into his bones. He wasn't ready to speak, but for the first time, he was finally quiet enough to listen. Pressure exposes more than diamonds. It exposes character. When Nicholas's financial stability dissolved, so did the unspoken agreement between him and Madison that Marlene would always be the emotional and economic buffer for their lifestyle. Arguments between them began sounding less like disagreements and more like audits. Madison blamed circumstances. Nicholas finally acknowledged choices. The turning point came when a bank notification lit up his phone at 2:04 a.m. Insufficient balance. The words glowed like a verdict. No dramatic music, no cinematic thunder, just two words delivering the truth he had avoided for years. His first instinct wasn't anger, it was exhaustion, the kind that comes when you realize you've been defending the wrong battlefield. The next morning, Nicholas drove to Marlene's house without calling ahead or rehearsing a speech. His hands were steady, but his voice wasn't ready. He stood outside like someone reading a familiar book and noticing the ending was different than he remembered. Emily saw him first through the window and opened the door without ceremony. No lectures, no, "I told you so." Just a quiet, "Come in." Marlene was sitting near the garden door in a knitted sweater that looked like forgiveness in fabric form, soft but structured. Nicholas expected disappointment, anger, or coldness. He found none of those. Silence can be louder than blame when acceptance has replaced expectation. All he managed to say was, "Mum, I lost the real home trying to defend the wrong one." Marlene didn't answer with emotion. She answered with action. She poured coffee. Not as reconciliation, not as surrender, but as acknowledgement. Some apologies must be drunk before they are spoken. Nicholas returned to apologize. Marlene stopped him gently, not because she didn't want to hear it, but because she didn't want to fake it. "Words apologize quickly," she said, stirring her coffee slowly. "Behavior tells the truth slowly." No aggression, no trembling, just honesty, older than disappointment. Nicholas nodded, realizing this was the first conversation where he wasn't performing. Madison was absent, not physically, but symbolically. This conversation was between cause and consequence, not audience and defense. Nicholas had arrived not asking for rescue, but requesting recognition of regret. That alone was different. Marlene looked at him with the kind of steady sadness that forgives without forgetting. She said, "I will always love you. I just won't shrink my worth to fit someone else's convenience again." It was a boundary, not a punishment. Nicholas felt the difference. Forgiveness negotiates. Boundaries conclude. He didn't argue, he didn't plead, he didn't cry. He simply said something more meaningful than any apology. "I will earn the right to sit at the table again." Then he left. No dramatic door slam, no rainstorm coincidence. Just footsteps moving away from entitlement and toward accountability. Marlene watched him go through the window without collapsing into emotion. When the door clicked shut, she whispered to an empty room, "Acknowledgement is heavier than sorry." And it was enough. Healing didn't happen in a montage. It happened in receipts, routine, restraint, and repetition. Nicholas paid debts in small, uncelebrated installments. He downsized life to stabilize it, worked double shifts without Instagram updates, and for the first time declined comparisons instead of performing them. He stopped defending narratives that required villains. He never asked Marlene for money,